I've got a box filled with a whole bunch of games I never play, Atari 2600 titles, and I know a lot of you out there probably have the exact same box sitting somewhere in some kind of closet or in your basement or something, and I get it. Those games are old and they're not that great to play, and in some cases, they're not as easy to play as they used to be. But does this new system from Hyperkin, the Retron 77, improve the ability to play these retro games? Or does it just kind of exist and there's no reason for it at all? Well, let's dive into it.
The Atari 2600 is the grandfather of video game systems, arriving on store shelves all the way back in 1977. The majority of accessories and video games released for the platform all came out over 3 decades ago. That means that you're dealing with a lot of old hardware that in many cases doesn't work as well as it used to. But for many gamers out there that want to play original Atari 2600 games on the original system, what holds them back is the way that it connects to modern televisions. And that's exactly what the Retron 77 aims to remedy. It's not attempting to be an emulation box where you steal ROMs from online and try and play them emulated on your TV. This is taking the original Atari 2600 cartridges and giving you the ability to play them in high definition. I know exactly what you're thinking right now. What's the point of playing these games in high definition? I mean, look at them. Did you really need to be playing this in 720p? Well, maybe and maybe not. I believe that these games look better in high definition than they ever did playing off the original hardware utilizing the old connectivity methods that we used to use in the past. And the reason is, well, the image was just a lot less clean. Sometimes you'd get artifacts and just blurry images that didn't represent what these games were capable of. So if you really wanted to see exactly how good they can possibly be, this might be the only way to do it, utilizing the original cartridges themselves. But before we take a look at the games, let's first take a look at the hardware itself. Now, Hyperkin has done a really great job with the Retron 77 console. It's got a pretty heavy weight to it, which is not typical for consoles like this. Usually they tend to be a little bit on the lighter side. And something else that you'll find is that this system has a lot of buttons and a lot of switches. And that's kind of important, because the original system itself, the Atari 2600, typically had game options that were accessible at the front of the system. But there are a couple of options here that you wouldn't find on a real Atari 2600. On the front, you'll find a save and a load button allowing you to save and load states at will while playing any of the games, and on the back you'll find a 4x3 and 16x9 button. Now, all the footage we recorded was done with the 4x3 option because that's how all the games were originally designed. But you'll also find a fry button. What does the fry button do? Well, it basically just jumbles up the code and does stuff like this. Sometimes you'll find that a game is playable, and sometimes it won't be, so that's just for fun, I guess. The console only has one method for video output, and that's through HDMI. The signal you're going to get out of this is a 720p signal at 60 frames per second. There is no way to change that or modify it at all. And another thing you'll find is a micro SD card slot. Now, initially when you get this system, you can power it on and you can play some homebrew games that are built into the console. But if you like, you can take out that micro SD card and switch out for a couple of other games if you happen to have the ROMs on you. Unfortunately though, you can't make a large library because there's no way to organize them by folder, meaning that you can only preload a handful of games on the micro SD card. The way that Hyperkin got games to run on the Retron 77 is the same way that they got games to run on the Retron 5, which is another system they designed that we took a look at a long time ago. Basically what's happening is when you put a cartridge in, it takes all the information from that game out of the cartridge and turns it into a ROM file that gets saved for a little bit onto the system itself. Then when it starts up, it's being emulated through software. And the software that they're using is Stella, a very well-known emulator that's available online for free. But one of the things that makes Stella so great is all the little features that you can change to modify the look of your game. And unfortunately with the Retron 77, it doesn't appear that any of those features are there at all. Now, while there is custom firmware that's being developed by fans at AtariAge.com and places like that, well, that isn't built in with the system. And to be honest, I just don't think it matters that much. If you really wanted to emulate a bunch of Atari games, you could probably do it better by just getting a pretty cheap computer to run those things, right? Getting this system is realistically just to run cartridges and to use the original accessories. If you're going to do anything other than that, you could probably do it a lot cheaper in a variety of different ways. And believe me, most of the time, it might just be easier and better to emulate. If you take a look at the controller that comes bundled with this system, it's not really a bad controller or anything, but it's mimicking what the original Atari joystick was like. And there's not a lot of play in it, and it's not really the best controller in the world, honestly, but it does play the games. If you were to go back and try any of the original Atari accessories plugged up to this thing, and many of them do work, you'll find that those controllers have aged so drastically that they simply don't work as well as they used to when they were new. You gotta remember that not only are some of these original controllers decades old, but they just don't work as well as they used to from years and years of play. And when it comes to the Atari games I bought, well, unfortunately, I never bought any brand new Atari game. I always got them used. So what I have are games that may or may not work. And although sometimes they work fine on the Atari 2600, I found that once in a while, they didn't work on the Retron 77. And this could be for a variety of reasons. And that's not even taking into consideration the problems you might have if the cartridge just isn't read properly and creates some visual artifacts on the screen. But when they do work, they work really, really well. I went through a ton of games, just playing them one after another and kind of experiencing what it was like to see these games, I imagine, back when they were new. And look, even back then, the connectivity method I talked about didn't give you a clean image. Even with those older TVs, it just wouldn't be the same. But what you're getting here is a much higher quality image that has absolutely no artifacts whatsoever as long as the cartridge was read. So if you look at Street Racer or Yar's Revenge, Star Raiders, Missile Command, anything like that, you're gonna get this crisp, clean image that is actually really cool. And I know people out there like to say that Atari games are not really that fun, but I don't agree. While it is true that many of the games you can find on the system are originally arcade releases that had better graphics and in some cases better controls, bringing them down and simplifying them to this design means that you get a different experience that you're unlikely ever going to find anywhere else. So I think that's what makes the Retron 77 so special. It's kind of a historical walk back for a lot of gamers of the modern day to go and see what games used to be like pretty much at the dawn of time. And I think that's what makes this so cool. But I know a lot of gamers out there are just not going to like this any way you cut it, and for them, I really wouldn't recommend it. This doesn't make Atari 2600 games any better than they were in the past, it just makes them easier to look at and easier to play on your modern television.
Well, Hyperkin, you did a pretty good job. I wasn't expecting it either because honestly, they're Atari games. The chances of them running well nowadays is pretty minor, but if you have a cartridge that does happen to work, you will get some good gameplay out of this. But Atari did also recently release a flashback collection that has 150 games in it, so maybe you just get that instead.